there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture, section 2.4. This is part 1, the Wars of Religion, and we will be focusing on the Wars of Religion of the 16th century. Our objective for today is to explain how matters of religion influenced and were influenced by political factors from 1450 to 1600. And the theme is states and other institutions of power. So that is, of course, our political theme. We are going to begin in the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of where we left off learning about Martin Luther and the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. So you might remember that Charles V was elected Holy Roman Emperor as well as he became King of Spain. Right, so he inherited the position of king in Spain, and then also as a Habsburg, he was elected the Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. Charles V was actually the most powerful monarch of the 16th century, controlling lots and lots of territory: Spain, the Netherlands, much of the Holy Roman Empire, right? He was really the greatest European monarch at the time, and we can see his sort of multicultural attitude through this quote that says, "I speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." Now, Charles V, as a Habsburg and Spanish king, was very, very Catholic, and he hoped to preserve the unity of the Catholic faith throughout his empire, and also he wanted to maintain dynastic control. So he wanted to preserve the unity of Catholicism, and he wanted to maintain dynastic control, which means he didn't want to lose any of the lands that his family controlled. However, with great power also comes great responsibility. And quite frankly, Charles V was not the most successful monarch because he was really overextended in his commitments. During his time as King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, he faced four major problems which were frequently interconnected. The first one was Martin Luther and his Protestant Reformation. The second one was the Schmalkaldic League, which we'll learn about in the next bullet point. The third one was the Habsburg-Valois Wars, and the fourth conflict was the Ottoman Empire and its threat to Eastern Europe. So we've already learned a little bit about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, but let's talk about some of the actual manifestations of combat, starting with the Schmalkaldic League and the eventual Peace of Augsburg. So to combat the spread of Lutheranism, Charles V ordered all Lutherans to return to the Catholic Church in 1531. So he felt that as Holy Roman Emperor, he could make this decree. But that's not, of course, what happened. In response to this order, many Lutheran princes joined together to create an alliance known as the Schmalkaldic League. And this led to a religious war that divided the Holy Roman Empire into two armed camps, the Catholic territories and the Lutheran territories. And on the map to your left, anything that is in green was Catholic. Anything that is in sort of that purpley blue, that will actually become Calvinist. And anything in yellow, that was Lutheran. Now, as much as Charles V really wanted to stop the spread of Lutheranism and other forms of Protestantism, the other conflicts here, such as the Habsburg-Valois Wars and the threat of the Ottoman Empire, kept him distracted and kept him out of the Holy Roman Empire. So that's, again, another reason why the Protestant Reformation did end up being so successful. Now, Charles would eventually have an opportunity to engage in conflict with the Lutheran princes, and this was a series of wars we call the Schmalkaldic Wars in the 1540s. And Charles V even defeated the Schmalkaldic League at the Battle of Mulberg. And at this point, Charles V was really at the height of his power. He had fought back the Ottomans. He had fought a lot with France in the Habsburg-Valois Wars, and he had also defeated some of those Lutheran princes. However, while he won the battle, he did not win the war. The Schmalkaldic League was ultimately reestablished, and they allied with the French king Henry II. Um, and this led to more conflict, and eventually Charles V was forced to agree to a truce. And that truce is known as the Peace of Augsburg, and this is a very important peace treaty that you should know, the Peace of Augsburg. So the Peace of Augsburg represents an important point in the Reformation because with this peace treaty, the division of Christianity is formally acknowledged. And Lutheranism was granted equal legal standing with Catholicism in the Holy Roman Empire. So Lutheranism was essentially legalized and recognized in the Holy Roman Empire. And also, German princes were given the right to determine the religion of their territory and their subjects, right? So German princes could now decide whether their state was going to be Catholic or Lutheran. And this is also one of the ways Lutheranism became very associated with states' rights, and why Protestantism also became such a political movement as well as a religious movement, because many of the German princes who opted for a Protestant territory did so to politically distance themselves from the Holy Roman Emperor and the papacy. Now, at the time, the Peace of Augsburg did not account for the new Protestant group of Calvinism. All right, so it did not account for Calvinism, and that will prove to be problematic later on. Next, we're moving on to the Habsburg-Valois Wars. And one thing I want to make very clear, and I need you to write this down, this is not a religious war, right? So the Habsburg-Valois Wars are not a religious war. I know I'm including them in this lecture about religious wars, but this one in particular, not a religious war. The Habsburg-Valois Wars were a series of battles between Charles V, who again was the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, and Francis I, the King of France. These conflicts emerged over disputed territory between the two families, right? Because Charles was part of the Habsburg dynasty, Francis was part of the Valois dynasty. So these conflicts emerged over disputed territory in places like southern France, the Netherlands, the Rhineland, northern Spain, and Italy. And the frequency of these conflicts really prevented Charles from concentrating on crushing Lutheranism within the Holy Roman Empire. So there were many, many, many battles in these wars. You can see that it lasted for 23 years, right? All these battles and all these conflicts. So this went on and on and on and on. And it started just 2 years after Charles became the Holy Roman Emperor. And I will say, one of the things that also contributed to the war is that Francis I was very upset that he did not get to be Holy Roman Emperor, because that was a very contentious election with many powerful people, including kings of various European states, competing to be the Holy Roman Emperor. But of course, Charles V was elected because he was also a Habsburg. Now, one notable event in the Habsburg-Valois Wars happened when the Pope, Clement VII, sided with France, right? He believed that a free papacy needed to be independent from the Holy Roman Empire and add to the balance of power, right? So he actually kind of wanted to distance himself from the Holy Roman Empire. But of course, Charles V is outraged by this. How dare the Pope side with the French, his enemy, when Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor and he's supposed to be the protector of the papacy? So this led to an event known as the Sack of Rome in 1527. And let's write that down. The Sack of Rome in 1527. The sacking of a city is like an attack of a city. And so Charles V actually had his Spanish army and mercenaries attack and pillage the city of Rome. This was actually the worst pillaging of the city of Rome ever, far worse than any of the barbarians, invasions that happened during the fall of Rome in late antiquity. And the sack of Rome in 1527 is also what definitively brings an end to the Renaissance in Rome and in much of Italy. And that's why we see a lot of the sort of cultural center of Europe move north. Um, Also part of the Habsburg-Valois Wars was the Habsburg-Valois Wars did get involved in the religious conflicts of the day. So as I mentioned earlier, the Valois monarchs like Francis I and Henry II would later ally with the Schmalkaldic League to exacerbate the divisions in the Holy Roman Empire and basically make things more difficult for Charles V there. But perhaps the most serious threat that Charles V had to deal with was the threat presented by the Ottoman Empire. As you might remember, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople in 1453, and that led to the fall of the Byzantine Empire. And shortly after this, the Ottoman Empire began to expand into the Balkans and make their way into Eastern Europe. By the time we get to the 16th century, the Ottomans were led by their Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. And Suleiman is spelled Suleiman. So Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest of all the Ottoman sultans. He was so successful that the Ottomans actually defeated and killed the king of Hungary in a battle there. And the Ottomans continued to advance all the way into Europe until they were at the gates of Vienna in Austria. And that's like the hometown of the Habsburgs. So these Turkish advances are actually what forced Charles more than anything to allow concessions to the Lutheran princes in the Holy Roman Empire in exchange for getting their support against the Turks, right? It was one of those moments where Charles had to decide which is worse, the Turks who are Muslim or the Lutheran princes. And so in that situation, he goes with the Turks, and so he asks the Lutheran princes to side with him to fight against the Turks because they can see that as a common enemy. However, one thing that also is kind of interesting here is sort of going back to the Habsburg-Valois Wars, the rivalry between Francis I of France and Charles V was so bitter that Francis I at this point even went around and sided with the Turks just so he could attack Charles V and get at him in another way. And so that's an example of how bitter that rivalry was between the two men and the two families. All right, so like I said, with great power came great responsibility. Even though he was a very powerful monarch, Charles V ultimately felt like he really wasn't that successful. I mean, he did stop the Ottomans from coming any further into Europe, but he wasn't able to stop Protestantism, and his whole reign as the king and the Holy Roman Emperor was defined by conflict. And so in about 1556, he actually abdicated, meaning he gave up his titles and he divided his empire. He actually gave the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, and then his son, Philip II, became the King of Spain. And Charles himself retired to a monastery where he spent the rest of his days in peace and prayer. Here is a good, before we move on to the next topic, I do want to show you this map, which I think is actually pretty useful to understand kind of the territory and the conflict, right? So this has to do really with the Habsburg-Valois Wars. So you can see the French territories there in green, and notice how the French are totally surrounded by the Habsburgs. There's Habsburgs in Spain and the Netherlands, right? And so this is why, another reason why the rivalry was so bitter. But also, when you look at the expansive Ottoman territory, all that blue area, you can see why the Ottomans were considered to be such a serious threat in the 16th century as well. So hopefully the geography you see here can kind of put these conflicts into perspective and help you understand you know, what was significant about the Habsburg-Valois Wars, and also why the Ottoman threat was so significant. Now we move on to the French Wars of Religion. So we're now focusing exclusively on the state of France. France was predominantly a Catholic country. However, in the mid 16th century, probably actually more about the 1530s, 1540s, the Reformation began to affect France. And some members of the French nobility and others began to convert to Calvinism. And these Calvinists in France were known as Huguenots. Excuse me. And while some of them were nobility, they came from all levels of society. Although I will say about 40 to 50% of the French nobility became Huguenots. And they were actually really influenced by the German idea in the Holy Roman Empire that princes and lords should be able to choose the religion for their estate. And also, many of these French nobles converted to Calvinism as a way to distance themselves and gain independence from the Valois monarchy. Most notably was a family known as the House of Navarre. Navarre is spelled Navarre. The House of Navarre was a powerful noble family in the south of France that converted to Protestantism, and they were actually distantly related to the Valois monarchy. And the reason that's significant is because that meant that the House of Navarre potentially had a claim to the French throne, which of course is concerning because the Valois and many other people in France do not want to see a Protestant monarch. By about 1559, approximately 10% of France had converted to Catholicism. However, like I said, France and the Valois monarchy was staunchly Catholic. You might remember the Concordat of Bologna in 1516. This had been an agreement between Francis I and the Catholic Church that had given French kings the ability to appoint clergy and control church policy. So since then, the Valois not only were Catholic by conviction and authentic sort of spiritual commitment, but also politically it gave them more power. And that is why the growth of Protestantism was seen as a potential threat to the stability and the power of the monarchy. And the growth of Protestantism was also perceived as a potential rebellion to the increasing centralization of the French monarchy as well. So here we kind of see two themes coming together. The theme of centralization that came with the rise of those new monarchs, but then also the theme of Protestantism and the expansion of Protestantism as a way for nobles to potentially resist that type of centralization. So let's take a moment to kind of understand what's going on in France in the 16th century. Let's pause and take stock of the context. So Francis I and his son Henry II, who are both considered to be new monarchs, had increased the power of the monarchy throughout the 16th century. And this meant that some groups like nobles and towns and even some provinces were resentful of these centralization efforts. Because remember, the feudal tradition keeps things very decentralized. France was also very large. It had about 18 million people in the 16th century and about 300 different areas or regions. And some of these regions were very independent provinces, places like Brittany, Burgundy, or Provence. However, France was also experiencing an economic crisis in the 16th century, especially as population growth began to outstrip the available resources. Remember, population growth is a major sort of social demographic of the 16th century. And so to compensate for this economic crisis, the government raised taxes But these taxes and the tithe, the tax of the church, really began to weigh quite heavily on the peasants of France, which is going to be a common theme for the next few centuries. Now, the unexpected and sudden death of Henry II is going to throw France into a bit of turmoil. So, Henry II had been a very powerful, capable king. He had married Catherine de' Medici from the famous Medici family, and they had three sons and as well as, I think, a few daughters. All right. And Henry II died suddenly and accidentally in a jousting tournament. You may be able to picture what jousting is. It's two men riding horses with huge lances charging at each other. And apparently, what happened is the king decided he needed to joust in this competition, and his lance shattered, and a wooden splinter got stuck deep into his eye, caused an infection, and he died painfully several days later. So this meant that his sons would inherit the throne, but at the time of his death, the oldest of his three sons was only 15, and this was about 1559, just so you know, is when all this started to happen. And also, all of the sons were weak and sickly or insane or otherwise incapable. None of them were going to be strong, competent, powerful monarchs like Francis I or Henry II. However, their mother, Catherine de' Medici, was a very, very effective monarch. Definitely someone we would consider to be Machiavellian. Now, because the boys were still so young, Catherine de' Medici ruled as regent, kind of like as a temporary, unofficial monarch of France. Um, and she was very, very effective. She was brutal. She was kind of cruel. Like I said, she was also Machiavellian. And that meant she wasn't very well liked. People in France referred to her as the wicked Italian queen of France, or spoke condescendingly and called her a shopkeeper's daughter, because the Medici were not a traditional noble family, right? They had begun as merchants. But despite Catherine's prowess at leading the state, this still was perceived as a lack of authority. And that ultimately led to a civil war in France between several powerful families: the Valois, who were the monarchs, the Guise, who were a powerful Catholic family, the Montmorencys, which were a Protestant family, and the Bourbon, which were another Protestant family. And I also want to point out that the Bourbon family was the House of Navarre. So the House of Navarre was sort of one title that they had because they lived in the region known as Navarre, but the family name was Bourbon. And again, they were Protestant. So these various powerful families, with which each had their own regional territory and armies, fought to gain control of the young monarchs. And this civil war eventually became a religious war defined by extreme violence. Protestants destroyed Catholic churches across France, and Catholics persecuted and executed Protestants at every opportunity. So this became a really bloody, brutal, destructive civil war in France that was not sustainable. So the obvious thing to do is look for a possible reconciliation, right? And so Catherine de' Medici proposed a marriage, all right? Marriages were a common way to make a political alliance and kind of settle things. So Catherine de' Medici proposed that her daughter, Margaret Valois, marry Henry of Navarre, kind of the prince of the Bourbon family. And this marriage was intended as a reconciliation of the Protestants and Catholics. That's kind of what it was advertised as. And as a result, many Protestant leaders from all over France traveled to Paris to attend the wedding. But this wasn't really a reconciliation as much as it was a trap for the Protestant leaders. Because behind this whole thing, Catherine de' Medici and the Duke of Guise, the leader of the Guise family, had arranged this mostly to plan a massacre of the Protestant leaders after the wedding. And so this is what leads to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre on August 24th of 1572. Shortly after the wedding, when everyone's sort of drunk and happy and carefree, the King's Guard and Catholic supporters murdered over 3,000 Protestants in Paris, including some of the most prominent Protestant leaders. This was a cruel and bloodthirsty, savage act, and it quickly spread to the countryside and reignited the Civil War, where thousands of Protestants would be killed. Now you may be asking, well, what happened to Henry of Navarre? Because wasn't he a Protestant who married the Queen's daughter? Well, he was spared because at that time he agreed to convert to Catholicism. However, as soon as he got out of Paris, which wasn't too much longer, he converted back to Protestantism. So again, he was spared because he agreed to be Catholic, but then he left Paris and went back to being a Protestant and went back to fighting for the Protestants. But still, this led to massive civil war in France. By October of 1572, over 12,000 Protestants had been killed in the aftermath of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. So this led to a new phase in the French Wars of Religion, which we call the War of the Three Henrys. This was between Henry III, who was the current king of France and part of the Valois family. It was also between Henry, the Duke of Guise, who was super Catholic, and Henry of Navarre of the Bourbon family, who, like I said, had converted back to Protestantism. Now, Henry, the Duke of Guise, earned the support of Philip II of Spain, who at the time was a very powerful and very Catholic monarch. And with the backing of Spain, the Duke of Guise was able to invade Paris and force Henry III to make the Duke of Guise his chief minister, which, for all intents and purposes, would allow the Duke of Guise to control the king and therefore control France. But shortly thereafter, Henry of Guise would be assassinated by supporters of Henry III, and then shortly after that, Henry III would be assassinated by rival Guise supporters, which leaves the victorious Henry, Henry of Navarre. And because he is not only the surviving Henry, but he also has a family connection to the throne, he becomes the new king of France, King Henry IV. And he is also known as a politique, and you may remember that term with Elizabeth. Now, of course, to become king of France, Henry actually had to convert back to Catholicism. This isn't going to be any type of Protestant revolution. But Henry, as a politique, did not actually see matters of religion as being more important than matters of peace and stability, so he had no problem converting back to Catholicism and even said, Paris is worth a mass. And again, as a politique, this demonstrates that as a leader, he was pragmatic and he recognized that no religion was worth the violence and conflict that disrupted the stability of the state. Basically, he valued political stability over religion. And as the King of France, he worked really, really hard to rebuild the French infrastructure and economy after 30 years of civil war. And this also makes him one of the most popular and well-remembered kings in all of French history. He apparently was so successful at rebuilding the French economy that sort of one of the phrases associated with Henry IV is he was able to put a chicken in every pot, meaning every family was able to be fed. Now, the French Wars of Religion would continue for a few more years until they were resolved by the Edict of Nantes. But regardless, with this new political stability under Henry IV and the new Bourbon family in charge of France, right? So we've had a change in the dynasties here. The Valois are done, and the Bourbon, Bourbon, are now in charge. This laid the foundations for the expansion of French royal power that would eventually become known as French absolutism in the 17th century. So France will actually develop the most powerful monarchs in Europe in the 17th century. But we'll learn about that. It's another story for another day. Let's finish up the French Wars of Religion by talking about the Edict of Nantes, which was established in 1598. Like the Peace of Augsburg, this is quite frankly a really important peace treaty for you to understand, all right, and to know. So, this is probably also one of Henry IV's greatest achievements. The Edict of Nantes still made Catholicism the official religion of France, but it granted Protestants the right to worship at home, the right to hold religious services, and the right to establish schools in some specified towns, which were mostly in the southwest and western portion of France. So Protestant, this is a piece of toleration, not a piece of acceptance, right? So Protestants were tolerated, but they were still basically considered a separate group on the margins of French life. Again, this is religious toleration out of necessity, not out of conviction. But it's still an example of the sort of Henry's pragmatic leadership. It's an example of how he was a politique. Unfortunately, this peace settlement did not solve all religious conflicts in France. We will still see religious conflict all across Europe into the 17th century. In fact, Henry IV would be murdered by a Catholic extremist in 1610 for his toleration of Protestants. And then one of Henry's descendants, the famous Louis XIV, would actually revoke the Edict of Nantes in 1685 and once again go after and try to expel the Protestants within France. So that brings us to the eventual showdown between Spain and England, which is sort of the culmination of religious and political conflict of the 19th century. Before we talk about the actual conflict, I do want to take a couple minutes to learn more about what was happening in Spain in the 16th century, in the later 16th century, and then also what was happening in England. So, as you might remember, Charles V abdicated his throne as King of Spain and gave it to his son, Philip II. And Philip II, another Habsburg monarch, will be one of the most powerful kings of Spain. He is known as the most Catholic king, as he was passionately, almost psychotically Catholic. But he also was the king of Spain during their golden age, the Siglo de Oro, because the 16th century is very much the Spanish century, where Spain had economic dominance with all that silver coming in from the New World. They were politically dominant. They were the most powerful country with the biggest army. And they also saw a flourishing of culture with literature and art, which we'll learn about later. Now, as the King of Spain, Philip II not only inherited Spain on the Iberian Peninsula, but also much of Spain's territory, which included the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and of course, most of North and South America. And as the most Catholic king, we have to remember that sort of religious zeal that defines Spanish culture, that Catholic fervor that characterized the crusading spirit of the Spanish. And the Spanish people still saw themselves as a chosen people, but specifically the chosen people to combat Protestantism, right? So Philip II really sees himself as the great, enemy of Protestantism. His goal as the monarch of Spain was to consolidate and secure his territory. So first of all, that meant that he enforced a strict conformity to Catholicism in all of his territories, a strict conformity to Catholicism. And to do this, he expanded the Spanish Inquisition, especially to places like the Netherlands. This also allowed him to establish strong royal authority, and this, of course, is part of the trends we see with the new monarchs as he worked to make the monarchy less dependent on the landed nobility. He ultimately wanted to make Spain the greatest power in all of Europe. However, he fell into one of the same traps that his father had. He basically had too many responsibilities as the King of Spain, and this led him to be more of a micromanager because he wanted to manage all of the governments and all of the departments himself. And this meant that he failed to distinguish between important and trivial matters. So he wasn't able to delegate, he wasn't able to differentiate between what was trivial and what was important. And this meant he became overwhelmed and he became less efficient throughout his reign as the King of Spain. And even though Spain was in a golden age, and even though it appeared that their economy was very prosperous, it was also very weak and unstable. While it may feel like there was all this gold and silver pouring in from the New World, in all reality, it was never more than 20% of Spain's national income. Spain also had other strong industries and agriculture. They had a strong textile industry and relatively strong commerce and trade as well. But again, the danger with all of that silver flowing into Spain is that it would cause inflation. It would devalue their currency and ultimately cause a negative economic impact. Spain also was involved in way too many wars, and wars were expensive. So even despite all of this money coming in, the government was spending it faster than it could make it. So despite this wealth, right, despite this power, Spain had so many expenses and so many wars that they began to fall into debt. And they tried to compensate for that debt by imposing crushing taxes on the peasantry. They were also forced to borrow money, and they actually repudiated, meaning they sort of, were unable to pay their debt at least 7 times. And by the end of Philip II's reign, which was in the late 16th century, I don't remember the exact date right now, about 2/3 of all the government revenue that came in went to just pay off debt. So 2/3 of the entire government budget went to pay off debt. All right. I do want to talk about a couple notable events, however, that took place during the reign of Philip II that represent some of these religious conflicts with also deep political meaning. Most notably, the Battle of Lepanto. The Battle of Lepanto was a huge sea battle on the Mediterranean Sea between the Spanish Navy and the Ottoman Empire. Like I said, the Ottoman Empire had been a real threat to Europe in the 16th century, where they had even laid siege to the city of Vienna, and they had reduced the power of the city of Venice, right? And they really were trying to invade and conquer as much of Europe as possible. But Philip was able to use the famous Spanish Armada, meaning the Spanish Navy, to defeat the Ottomans in a stunning victory in the Mediterranean Sea at the Battle of Lepanto. And this was really kind of like the peak of Philip's power, the peak of Spanish power. Now that the Spanish had defeated the Ottomans, and from this point on, the Ottomans will sort of retreat and will no longer advance into Europe. This made Spain definitively the most powerful state in all of Europe. Now, another major conflict that Philip had to deal with was the revolt of the Netherlands. All right, so the Netherlands were actually controlled by the Spanish at this time. And the people of the Netherlands did not like being ruled by a foreign power. They did not like being ruled by the Spanish. And also, the Reformation had been very successful in the Netherlands. Most of the people who lived in the Netherlands, who we would call Dutch, had converted to Calvinism. And this revolt against Spain was rooted not only in their resistance to Catholic domination and their resistance to being ruled by a foreign power, but also their deep resentment of taxation. If you think about the American Revolution and how the colonists of the Americas resented paying taxes that would support Britain's wars, that's how the Dutch felt. The Dutch did not like paying taxes that were used to fight Spain's wars. The merchants of the Netherlands, which were a very prominent and populous group, were especially resistant to taxation. And remember, at this point, the Netherlands were becoming a much more prosperous society because of trade, and they were kind of like the Italian city-states in their heyday, being ruled by merchants and merchant oligarchies. So Philip II, in his goal to consolidate and secure his empire, tried to brutally crush the Dutch revolt, and this actually only caused more resistance. He even sent his most powerful allies, not allies, but like his most powerful subordinates, like dukes and things like that. He sent them to the Netherlands to implement the Inquisition and try to force obedience and force a return to Catholicism. But that didn't work either. And this leads us to meet William of Orange. So William of Orange was from a powerful Dutch family, the House of Orange, basically, and he became the leader of the Dutch resistance. And he actually appealed to England for assistance and support, and also he appealed to France. Now, England was more than willing to give their support to the Dutch in their revolt against Spain, because they wanted to weaken Spain, the most powerful state in Europe at the time. And even the French were willing to support the Dutch as much as they were at least capable of at that point, because remember, France was also embroiled in their own civil war. So William of Orange used some of this support to actually encourage pirates to attack Spanish ships coming back from the New World. But this then led the Spanish to respond by sacking the city of Antwerp, which at the time was the wealthiest commercial city in all of Europe. Now, the Netherlands at this point consisted of what we consider to be the modern day Netherlands, but also what is modern day Belgium. So, kind of a northern Netherlands and a southern Netherlands. And what would eventually happen is that the northern provinces of the Netherlands would ally together and become what was known as the Dutch Republic. And that will eventually become what we know as the modern day Netherlands today. All right. Whereas the southern provinces remain Spanish and remain Catholic, and that eventually, much, much later, becomes Belgium. But the northern Netherlands, which were now known as the Dutch Republic, they're also sometimes called the United Provinces, so keep that in mind, would continue to fight Spain well into the 17th century. So we could actually say that the Dutch revolts, this conflict between the Dutch Republic and Spain, would last for 80 years, because Spain did not officially recognize the independence of the Dutch Republic until 1648. But regardless, even with this war with Spain, the Dutch Republic developed into a thriving economy, and this was partially due to their religious toleration. The Netherlands were one of the few places in Europe that welcomed Protestants, including radical groups like the Anabaptists that welcomed Jews, and this led to their commercial success. And you also may remember from the Age of Exploration lectures that the Dutch were able to expand and control lots of the trade routes all across the world. They were able to take many of those from the Portuguese. And while this war would actually lead to the growth and the success of the Dutch Republic, the war would, on the other hand, contribute to the decline of Spain, because it was expensive and it was time consuming, and ultimately it would be unsuccessful. Now, before we get to the showdown, I also need to tell you a little bit about England, particularly England during the Elizabethan age. Now, Queen Elizabeth, the younger daughter of Henry VIII that he had with Anne Boleyn, was the last of the Tudor monarchs, but she was also the most capable, the most effective, and the most successful of the Tudor monarchs. And one may argue one of the best monarchs in all of English history, quite frankly. It turns out that the queens in English history not only rule for a really long time, but they also usher in these periods of peace and prosperity. It's almost like, women are better rulers in this situation, but we don't need to argue about that right now. Anyways, one of the first things Elizabeth had to deal with when she became queen was repairing England, which had been defined by this religious conflict. You might remember that her sister Mary had tried to make England Catholic again, basically. But that was met with great resistance as Protestantism was closely identified with English identity and early English nationalism. And so Elizabeth reinstated Protestantism and reinstated many Protestant reforms. And this was known as the Elizabethan Settlement of 1559. And this was ultimately a religious settlement based on moderation and compromise. Moderation and compromise. So that may remind you kind of Henry IV in France, because he also was a politique. So the two monarchs that are really your prime examples of politiques were Elizabeth I of England and Henry IV of France. So in the Elizabethan settlement, Elizabeth was able to develop a modern Protestantism that really avoided extremes. It kind of took some ideas from Lutheranism, it took some ideas from Calvinism. It also, to some extent, was still kind of a bit of diet Catholicism, but it was moderate, it was broad, it wasn't really extreme in any ways. And this settlement demonstrates her intelligence, also her cautious but confident personality, which made her so successful. In 1559, she also had Congress pass the Act of Uniformity and the Act of Supremacy. And this again also helped to establish the Church of England. This established a church that had essentially Protestant doctrine, but with a Catholic structure, right? So it still had a clerical hierarchy. It still had a lot of the kind of fanciness of the Catholic Church. And it also made Elizabeth the, quote, supreme governor of the realm, instead of having her be named the, quote, head of the church. But by naming her the supreme governor of the realm instead of the head of the church, she was, for all intents and purposes, the secular and religious leader. But this language was designed to appease Catholics in England and minimize their resistance to her rule. And so, as a result, most religious disputes were settled during Elizabeth's reign, most of them. However, there will still be some opposition from Catholics and from Puritans, a more extreme type of Protestantism that came from Calvinism. In fact, one of the bigger conflicts that Elizabeth had to deal with during her time as queen was a conflict directly with her first cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was the Queen of Scotland at the same time Elizabeth was the Queen of England. Mary, Queen of Scots, was from the Stuart family, Stuart. And early in her life, Mary Stuart had actually been the Queen of France. She was briefly married to Francis II, who had been one of those sons of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. But after Francis died, Mary, Queen of Scots, actually returned to Scotland to rule there, although she had been spending most of her life in France. But when she returned to Scotland, she discovered that Scotland had mostly converted to Protestantism. This was this is thanks to John Knox and his introduction of Calvinism, which would become the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And so Mary, Queen of Scots, wasn't really welcomed in Scotland as a Catholic monarch. In fact, she was ousted by Protestant leaders, and she had to flee to England to seek protection from Elizabeth, who, like I said, was her cousin. And Elizabeth was willing to protect Mary, but also she had to put Mary under house arrest. The reason for this is because Mary was the heir to Elizabeth, right? So Elizabeth never married, she never had children, and that meant her closest relative was Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic monarch. And one of the things Elizabeth had to deal with are some assassination plots from Catholic supporters who wanted to replace Elizabeth with Mary, right? So that was the issue here, is that, there was not a lot of, family love and friendliness between Mary and Elizabeth, because Mary also saw herself as the rightful heir to the throne of England. She would love to have that opportunity. She had many Catholic supporters, both in England and elsewhere, that wanted to see her on the throne of England. And yes, there were many assassination attempts against Elizabeth to make this happen. So Elizabeth, like I said, was allowed Mary, Queen of Scots, into England, but put her under house arrest for 14 years. Eventually, Mary would be indicted, meaning she was accused and found guilty of participating in several assassination plots against Elizabeth. And Elizabeth had no choice but to order the execution of her cousin. And so in 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded on the orders of Elizabeth I of England. Now, that is actually what will cause the big conflict between England and Spain, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. But before that, I do want to talk about how successful Elizabeth was as queen, as essentially the leader of England. As I mentioned, Elizabeth was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married, she never had children, and that also meant that she did not have to compromise her power. She also faced significant challenges, challenges from within England by her own Catholic subjects, challenges by the papacy, who actually put a bounty on her head, and challenges from Philip II, the King of Spain and the most powerful monarch in Europe at the time. But she was able to fend off those challenges and become a very popular queen. She actually used patronage to foster loyalty to the crown, this meant that her advisors were very close to her. She also did not call Parliament very frequently, which allowed her to rule independently. She was very frugal in her expenses, which meant that she tried to avoid costly wars, and this allowed her to replenish the English treasury, get England out of debt that her father had put England in. And this, of course, led to a stronger and more efficient state. And eventually, this meant that England would become more powerful than even France or Spain, right? So she does a very, very good job of being Queen of England and bringing England out of the chaos of the Reformation and creating a stable, prosperous state. And that's, again, one of the reasons why the Elizabethan age is known as one of the golden ages of English history. But her greatest conflict was the war with Spain, right? So that brings us to our last slide and our last topic of this lecture, the showdown between England and Spain, which represents the religious conflicts of the 16th century, So first of all, to understand this, we need to take a look at Philip II and his tumultuous relationship with English queens. You might remember that Philip II had married Mary the First, which also happened to be his first cousin. And in his marriage to Mary the First, he had hoped that together they would return England to Catholicism. But Mary then unfortunately died in 1558. And after Mary died, Philip then proposed marriage to Elizabeth. He thought, like, well, why doesn't the younger sister want to marry me? I'm the king of Spain. I'm the most powerful guy in Europe. And Elizabeth was like, thanks, but no thanks. She immediately rejected him. And of course, Philip was furious by this rejection. He felt that he deserved England, and also he felt that Elizabeth had no right to be queen. The Catholics across Europe did not view her as legitimate since she was born to Henry's second wife. And of course, she was a woman and she was Protestant, so that was just adding insult to injury in the eyes of the Catholics. Now, for much of her reign, Elizabeth had practiced a cautious and moderate foreign policy. She did everything she could to avoid open war, which was expensive. However, she also recognized that the Spanish were a major threat. So she would encourage English pirates to raid Spanish ships and colonies. Specifically, she utilized the famous English explorer Francis Drake for these types of missions. She also provided secret aid to the Dutch Republic to weaken Spain, and she also secretly supported the Protestants in France during the French Wars of Religion to keep France divided and weak. She also avoided troublesome alliances and kept England fairly independent and separate from the numerous conflicts which were taking place on the continent at that time. But regardless, it was the conflict in the Netherlands, it was the Dutch revolt that would eventually lead to a war between England and Spain. Now, all throughout the 16th century, there had been increasing tension and friction and competition between England and Spain. There had been economic competition over the age of exploration and colonies in the New World. There was also religious division, of course, as England became Protestant, and there was a huge insult to Catherine of Aragon there. And so this conflict is considered to be part of the overall religious conflicts of the 16th century. The catalyst that really began all of this was England's involvement in the Dutch Republic's revolt against Spain, and this really angered Philip II when he found out about it. And this would eventually lead to open conflict, and Philip decided to send the Spanish Armada, the Spanish Navy, to invade England, and this took place in 1588. So, while England's support of the Dutch revolt was one of the motivating factors for Philip to invade England, or at least try to invade England, as we will see, the other contributing factor was actually Elizabeth's execution of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Because when Elizabeth executed Mary, Queen of Scots, who was still technically another Catholic monarch, this caused the Pope at the time to declare her a heretic and launch a Catholic crusade against Elizabeth and basically put a bounty on her head. Philip II, as the most Catholic king and the defender of Catholicism and the fighter against Protestantism, decided that this meant he needed to invade England. He was also convinced to do this by his advisors. Philip II believed that when Spain arrived in England, and when he arrived in England, the people of England would rise up and rebel against their heretic Protestant queen and accept Philip as their true Catholic king. That's not at all going to be what happens, of course. Philip also realized, pragmatically, that the revolt in the Netherlands would never be crushed while the English were still capable of supporting the Dutch rebels in those northern provinces. So in 1558, Philip assembled one of the largest invasion forces that Europe had seen up to that point. Over 130 ships with 30,000 men would sail from Spain up to England for the purpose of trying to invade England and conquering it for Spain. But when they get to the English Channel, which is this body of water between England and the continent, they were intercepted by the English Navy, which was sitting there and waiting for them. And it turns out that the English ships were much smaller, they were much lighter and more maneuverable, and they were able to single out the larger Spanish ships, these big fat galleons, and were able to single them out and slowly demolish them one by one. But there was still more Spanish ships than English ships, so this was really just kind of chipping away. And it wasn't guaranteed that the English would be able to defeat the Spanish this way. However, this leads to what is considered to this next event leads to what is considered to be kind of like a miracle for the English. In these religious conflicts, it's often argued, what side was God on? Was God fighting for the Catholics? Was God fighting for the Protestants? Well, in this scenario, it became very clear that God was on Team Protestant, because in the midst of this battle, a huge storm blew into the English Channel. This is called the Protestant wind. And this storm blew the Spanish Armada north out of the channel. These Spanish ships were dragged up along the coast of England, north to Scotland, down along the western coast of Ireland, where many of them were shipwrecked. You can see on this map here all those little black triangles on the western coast of Scotland where many of those Spanish galleons were shipwrecked. And out of 130 ships that left Spain, only about 60 were accounted for after this embarrassing defeat, and thousands of Spanish soldiers were dead. So this demonstrated that Spain would not be able to invade England. And this is one of the events that would also contribute to the decline of Spain in the later 16th century and into the 17th. Now, this did not end the war between England and Spain. England and Spain would continue to fight until about 1604. But like I said, the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was an enormous blow to Philip II and Spain. It became a symbol for the decline of Spanish dominance, and it also opened the door for English dominance. It opened the door for Dutch trade, and it also represented the larger shift in the balance of power from Southern Europe in the 16th century to Northern Europe in the 17th century and beyond. So that brings an end to the first part of our lecture series on the Wars of Religion. This was all about the 16th century. Please stay tuned for part 2, which will be the Wars of Religion of the 17th century. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.